April 23rd, 1945. The morning mist hung low over the Bavarian countryside as Private First Class Thomas Richardson of the 320th Infantry Regiment advanced through the abandoned German village of Oberkirchen. The acrid smell of smoke from distant fires mixed with the sweet scent of spring apple blossoms, creating an almost surreal atmosphere in what had been just hours before contested territory. Richardson believed this day would be like any other in their push toward Munich. Routine sweeps, abandoned positions, and perhaps a few stragglers to process as prisoners of war. He had no idea that what he would discover in the next few minutes would challenge everything he thought he knew about human dignity and forever change his understanding of what they were truly fighting for. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Private Richardson was about to witness would transform him from a soldier simply following orders into a man who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with simple acts of human compassion that restore dignity to those who have been stripped of everything, including their very humanity. The village of Oberkirchen sat nestled in a valley approximately 15 kilometers southeast of Nuremberg, its cobblestone streets now eerily silent after the hasty retreat of German forces the previous evening. The American advance through this sector had been methodical and largely unopposed, with the German army of the time conducting a fighting withdrawal toward their remaining strongholds. For Private Richardson, a 22-year-old farm boy from Nebraska, this represented his 47th day of continuous operations since crossing the Rhine River in March. Richardson moved cautiously through the village center, his M1 Garand rifle held at the ready, though intelligence reports suggested minimal resistance in this area. The 89th Infantry Division, to which his regiment belonged, had been tasked with clearing these smaller communities, while the main armored thrusts pushed toward the larger industrial cities. It was tedious work, but essential for securing their flanks and ensuring no bypassed enemy units could threaten their supply lines. The morning sun cast long shadows between the half-timbered buildings, many of which showed signs of hasty abandonment. Doors stood ajar, personal belongings scattered in yards, and the occasional white sheet hung from upper-story windows, the universal symbol of surrender that had become increasingly common as German resistance crumbled throughout Bavaria. Richardson's squad had split up to cover more ground efficiently. Sergeant Murphy had taken 3 men to check the eastern approach, while Richardson and Private Collins were assigned to sweep the village center and the area around what appeared to be a small town square. The tactical situation seemed routine enough. They had encountered similar abandoned positions dozens of times over the past weeks. As Richardson rounded the corner of the village bakery, the sweetness of stale bread still lingering in the air from ovens that had gone cold days ago, he noticed something unusual in the small square ahead. At first it appeared to be merely another piece of abandoned equipment or perhaps damaged property left behind by the retreating forces. The morning light played tricks with shadows, and his tired eyes needed a moment to focus properly. Then he saw her. Tied to a wooden post in the center of the square stood a woman, her head bowed forward in what might have been unconsciousness or exhaustion. She appeared to be African, though Richardson's limited experience with people of different backgrounds made him uncertain. What struck him immediately was her condition, clearly malnourished, her clothing little more than tattered rags, and, most disturbing of all, a crude wooden sign hanging around her neck. Richardson felt his heart rate increase as he approached more carefully, his training warring with his human instincts. This could be a trap, some sort of elaborate snare left behind by retreating German forces. Such tactics had been reported elsewhere, though rarely in situations quite like this. Yet something about the woman's obvious suffering overrode his tactical caution. As he drew closer, the words on the sign became visible, written in stark German script that he could partially understand from his basic language training: Nicht menschlich, not human. The impact of those words hit Richardson like a physical blow. He had heard reports, rumors really, about the treatment of various groups by the German regime of that era, but seeing the evidence so starkly presented challenged his ability to process what he was witnessing. This was not a military installation or a strategic position. This was a public square where ordinary citizens would have walked past daily, presumably accepting or ignoring what was happening here. Richardson quickly scanned the surrounding buildings for any signs of enemy presence, then called out softly to Private Collins, who was checking a building approximately 50 meters away. Collins approached at a run when he heard the urgency in Richardson's voice, then stopped short when he saw what had captured his partner's attention. "Sweet Jesus," Collins whispered, his rifle lowering involuntarily. Collins, a carpenter from Maine, had seen his share of the war's brutality over the past year, but this scene left him momentarily speechless. The woman raised her head slightly at the sound of their voices, revealing a face that spoke of prolonged suffering, but retained a dignity that the crude sign around her neck could never truly diminish. Her eyes, though exhausted, showed intelligence and awareness. She appeared to be in her 30s, though malnutrition and hardship made such estimates difficult. Richardson approached slowly, his hands visible and his weapon pointed away from her, speaking in the few German phrases he had learned during his months in the European theater. "Amerikanische Soldaten," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "American soldiers. We are here to help." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and Richardson could see a complex mixture of hope and disbelief cross her features. How long had she been here? How many people had simply walked past accepting the message of that terrible sign? Collins had moved to watch their flanks while Richardson worked to untie the ropes binding the woman to the post. The knots were complex, clearly designed to prevent escape, and showed signs of having been in place for an extended period. As he worked, Richardson found himself speaking continuously, not sure if she understood English, but hoping the tone of his voice would convey his intentions. "So you're safe now," he said, his voice steady despite the anger building within him. "We're going to get you out of here and get you some help. Can you understand me?" To his surprise, she responded in accented but clear English. "Yes, I understand you. Are you truly American soldiers?" Richardson paused in his work with the ropes, struck by the directness of her question. "Yes, ma'am. Private First Class Thomas Richardson, 320th Infantry Regiment, United States Army. This is Private Collins. What's your name?" "Marie," she said simply, then, after a moment's hesitation, added, "Marie Delacroix. I was a teacher before all this." The ropes finally gave way, and Richardson carefully helped steady her as she found her balance. It was clear she had been restrained for some time. Her legs were unsteady, and circulation was slowly returning to her arms. Collins appeared with a canteen of water, which she accepted gratefully, but drank slowly, clearly understanding the need for caution after prolonged deprivation. As Marie regained some strength, Richardson found himself struggling with questions that his military training had not prepared him for. His immediate concern was her physical condition and safety, but beyond that lay larger questions about what she had endured and how she had come to be in this situation. "Marie," Richardson said carefully, "can you tell us how long you've been here, and are there others like you in the area?" Marie's eyes filled with tears, though she maintained her composure. 3 days tied to this post, but weeks before that in other places. As for others. She paused, seeming to gather strength for what she had to say. There were others, many others. But I believe I may be the last one left in this village. Richardson felt a cold anger building in his chest, but he forced himself to maintain professional composure. His job was to help this woman and gather information that might assist other Allied forces in similar situations. Personal emotions, however justified, could wait. Collins had been monitoring their radio frequency and now approached with news. "Sarge wants us to report our position and any findings. What do I tell him?" Richardson considered this for a moment. Standard procedure would be to report the discovery of a displaced civilian and request guidance on disposition. But something about this situation felt far from standard, and he sensed that Marie's story contained information that might be crucial for understanding what Allied forces were encountering as they penetrated deeper into German territory. "Tell Sergeant Murphy we've found a civilian who was being held against her will, and that she may have important intelligence about enemy activities in this area. Request permission to escort her to the company command post for proper debriefing." As Collins relayed this information, Richardson continued his assessment of Marie's condition. Beyond obvious malnutrition and the effects of prolonged restraint, she seemed to be in remarkably good mental condition given what she had endured. Her English, while accented, was precise and educated, supporting her claim to have been a teacher. "Marie, I need to ask you some questions that might help us understand what's been happening here. But first, are you injured? Do you need immediate medical attention?" Marie considered this carefully before responding. "I am weak and hungry, but not seriously injured in ways that cannot wait. What I need most is to tell someone in authority what I have seen and experienced. There are things happening that your army should know about." Richardson nodded, understanding that whatever intelligence Marie possessed might indeed be valuable. The German regime's treatment of various populations had been the subject of reports and rumors, but first-hand testimony from someone who had experienced it directly could provide crucial details for Allied intelligence services. Sergeant Murphy's voice crackled over the radio, confirming that Richardson and Collins were authorized to escort the civilian to the company command post, located in a larger village approximately 3 kilometers to the west. The sergeant also reported that similar discoveries had been made by other units in the area, suggesting a pattern that was becoming clearer as Allied forces advanced. As they prepared to move, Richardson offered Marie his field jacket, which she accepted gratefully. The morning air was still cool, and her tattered clothing provided little protection against the elements. Collins had located a wooden crate that could serve as a temporary seat, allowing Marie to rest as they waited for transportation or prepared for the walk to the command post. During this brief respite, Richardson found himself observing Marie more carefully. Despite everything she had endured, she carried herself with a dignity that impressed him. Her posture, even in her weakened state, suggested someone accustomed to respect and authority, consistent with her claim to have been an educator. "Marie, if you don't mind me asking, how did you come to be in Germany? Your English suggests you're not German." Marie smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of anything approaching warmth that Richardson had seen from her. "I am originally from French Cameroon, in Africa. I came to France to study at the Sorbonne in Paris, where I earned my teaching credentials. When the conflict began, I was working at a school in Strasbourg." Richardson's knowledge of geography was limited, but he understood enough to realize that Marie's journey from Africa to France to Germany must have been complex and probably involuntary. The German occupation of France explained part of it, but the specific circumstances that brought her to this Bavarian village remained unclear. When the German forces occupied eastern France, teachers and other professionals were often relocated to serve German administrative needs. I was initially assigned to teach German language to French children, part of their cultural assimilation program. Later, when my background became more of an issue for them, my situation changed significantly. The euphemistic way Marie described her background becoming an issue spoke volumes about the systematic nature of what she had experienced. Richardson was beginning to understand that Marie's story was not simply one of individual hardship, but rather a window into larger policies and practices that the German regime had implemented across occupied territories. Collins returned from his radio check with additional information. "Sarge says there's a truck coming to pick us up in about 15 minutes. He also said there's an intelligence officer at the command post who specifically wants to speak with any civilians we've found who might have information about German policies toward, certain populations." Richardson nodded, understanding that Marie's testimony would likely be valuable not just for immediate tactical purposes, but for the larger effort to document and understand what Allied forces were uncovering as they advanced through German-controlled territory. As they waited for transportation, Richardson found himself thinking about the sign that had been hung around Marie's neck. The casual cruelty of it disturbed him deeply, not just the message itself, but the implication that it was meant to be seen by ordinary German civilians, who would presumably accept and perhaps even support such treatment. "Marie, I hope you don't mind me asking, but that sign, how long were you displayed like that? And did people see you?" Marie's expression darkened, though she maintained her composure. "People saw me, yes. Some looked away quickly, others stared. A few children threw stones, but I believe they were imitating adult behavior rather than acting from personal malice. What disturbed me most was not the active cruelty, but the passive acceptance of so many who simply walked past as if I were not there at all. Richardson struggled to process this information. His understanding of civilian populations had been shaped by his experiences in American communities, where such a display would have provoked outrage and immediate intervention. The idea that people could simply ignore such obvious suffering challenged his assumptions about human nature. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his thoughts. A jeep appeared around the corner, driven by a young corporal with Sergeant Murphy riding in the passenger seat. Murphy quickly assessed the situation, his experienced eyes taking in Marie's condition and the remnants of the sign that Collins had removed from around her neck. "Private Richardson, good work," Murphy said as he dismounted from the jeep. "Ma'am," he continued, addressing Marie directly, "I'm Sergeant Murphy, United States Army. We're going to take you somewhere safe, where you can get proper food and medical attention, and where you can tell your story to people who need to hear it." Marie nodded, her dignity intact despite her obvious relief. "Thank you, Sergeant. I am ready to tell what I have seen and experienced. It is important that the truth be known." As they helped Marie into the jeep, Richardson found himself reflecting on the morning's events. When he had awakened that day, his concerns had been tactical and immediate, clearing buildings, securing positions, and advancing toward their next objective. Now he was grappling with questions about human dignity, systematic cruelty, and the responsibility that came with liberation. The jeep ride to the company command post took them through countryside that showed increasing signs of the German retreat. Abandoned equipment lined the roads, white flags hung from farmhouse windows, and occasionally they passed groups of German civilians moving westward with whatever possessions they could carry. Richardson noticed that Marie watched these scenes with particular attention, her expression unreadable. When they passed a group of German women and children walking along the road, Richardson saw her stiffen slightly, though she made no comment. "Marie, are you all right?" Richardson asked, concerned that seeing German civilians might be distressing given her recent experiences. Marie considered her response carefully. "It is complex. I feel no hatred for these people as individuals. Many of them probably had no direct involvement in what happened to me. But I also cannot forget that others like them watched me suffer and did nothing. It will take time for me to separate individual Germans from the system that harmed me." Richardson found her response remarkably measured and thoughtful. In her position, he thought he might feel much less charitable toward any representatives of the nation that had treated her so cruelly. The company command post had been established in a larger village called Steinbach, in what had previously been the local school building. American flags flew from improvised poles, and the organized activity of a functioning military headquarters contrasted sharply with the abandoned German positions they had been encountering. Captain Morrison, the company commander, personally greeted Marie as she was helped from the jeep. A tall, serious man from Virginia, Morrison had clearly been briefed on the nature of Richardson's discovery and understood its significance. "Miss Delacroix, welcome to our command post. I want to assure you that you are completely safe here and that we will provide you with food, medical attention, and anything else you need. When you feel ready, there are some people who would very much like to hear your story, but there is no pressure. Your well-being is our primary concern right now." Marie straightened as much as her condition allowed. "Captain Morrison, I appreciate your courtesy and kindness. I am ready to tell my story whenever it would be most helpful. I understand that what I have experienced may provide information useful to your forces and to those who will need to understand what happened here." Richardson was struck again by Marie's dignity and sense of purpose. Despite everything she had endured, her primary concern seemed to be ensuring that her experiences contributed to some larger understanding or benefit for others. A medical corpsman appeared, and with Marie's permission conducted a preliminary examination. His findings confirmed what Richardson had observed: severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the effects of prolonged restraint, but no injuries requiring immediate emergency treatment. The corpsman recommended food, fluids, rest, and more comprehensive medical evaluation as soon as practical. While Marie received initial care, Captain Morrison briefed Richardson and Collins on the broader situation. Similar discoveries had been reported by units advancing across Bavaria and Austria. Intelligence personnel were working to document these findings and understand the systematic nature of what appeared to be widespread mistreatment of various civilian populations. Private Richardson, your discovery and the way you handled the situation reflects well on you and on this unit, Morrison said. The intelligence people will want to debrief you as well, to understand exactly what you found and how it was set up. These details may be important for understanding enemy practices and policies. An hour later, Major Sarah Goldman arrived from Division Intelligence. Goldman, a lawyer in civilian life, who had been specifically assigned to document war crimes and gather evidence for potential post-conflict proceedings, brought with her a stenographer and recording equipment to properly preserve Marie's testimony. Goldman's approach was professional but compassionate, clearly recognizing the sensitivity of what Marie had experienced while understanding the importance of gathering complete and accurate information. Miss Delacroix, I want to explain what we're doing here and give you complete control over how we proceed. We believe your experiences may provide important evidence about policies and practices that affected many people across German-controlled territory. Your testimony could help ensure that what happened to you and to others is properly documented and understood. However, your participation is entirely voluntary, and you can stop at any time if you become uncomfortable. Marie had been provided with clean clothing, hot food, and a cot in a private area where she could rest. The improvement in her appearance after just a few hours of proper care was remarkable, though the psychological effects of her experiences would clearly take much longer to address. Major Goldman, I understand what you are asking and why it is important. I am willing to tell you everything I remember in as much detail as you need, but I want to ask you something first. Will this information be used to help other people who may still be suffering in similar situations? Goldman nodded seriously. Absolutely. Part of our mission is to identify areas where civilians may still be in danger and need immediate assistance. Additionally, documenting these experiences will be crucial for ensuring accountability and preventing such things from happening again. With that assurance, Marie began her testimony, which would continue for several hours and fill dozens of pages of transcription. Richardson was asked to remain available to provide his account of the discovery, but he found himself thinking less about the formal reporting requirements and more about the human dimensions of what he had witnessed. Marie's story, as it unfolded through Goldman's careful questioning, revealed a systematic progression from respected professional to dehumanized victim. Initially assigned to teaching duties in occupied Strasbourg, she had been tolerated as long as she remained useful to German administrative needs. However, as policies toward African populations became more severe, her status deteriorated rapidly. She described being transferred from one location to another, across eastern France and eventually into Germany, each move reducing her status and freedom further. The final stage, which brought her to Oberkirchen, involved her being essentially displayed as an example of what the regime considered subhuman, a living demonstration of their racial theories for the local population to observe and accept. What made Marie's account particularly valuable from an intelligence perspective was her education and observational skills. As a trained teacher, she had instinctively documented details about locations, dates, personnel, and procedures that provided investigators with specific information about how these policies were implemented at the local level. Richardson listened to portions of Marie's testimony with growing anger and admiration. Anger at what she had endured, and admiration for her strength and clarity in describing it. Her account made clear that what he had discovered in Oberkirchen was not an isolated incident, but rather one small example of a much larger system of dehumanization and abuse. Major Goldman's questions revealed the scope of Marie's experiences across multiple locations and her observations of how local populations responded to the treatment of people like herself. In some places, she reported, civilians had shown kindness when they could do so safely. In others, they had actively participated in or encouraged abuse. The most difficult thing to understand, Marie explained to Goldman, was not the cruelty of those who harmed me directly, but the indifference of those who simply accepted what was happening as normal. When people become accustomed to seeing others treated as less than human, it becomes easier for them to ignore suffering that they could not have ignored before. Richardson found this observation particularly troubling. He had grown up in a small Nebraska farming community where neighbors helped neighbors almost automatically. The idea that ordinary people could become conditioned to ignore obvious suffering challenged his understanding of human nature and community responsibility. As evening approached, Major Goldman concluded the formal portion of Marie's testimony, though she assured Marie that additional questions might arise as the information was analyzed and correlated with other reports. For now, Marie would be evacuated to a displaced persons facility further behind the lines where she could receive comprehensive medical care and begin the process of recovery. Before her departure, Marie specifically asked to speak privately with Richardson, the soldier who had found her and removed the sign that had declared her not human. Private Richardson, I want to thank you, not just for freeing me, but for seeing me as a person deserving of help when others had learned to see me as something less. What you did this morning was more than following military procedures. It was an act of simple human decency that reminded me that such decency still exists. Richardson, uncomfortable with praise for what seemed to him like obvious human behavior, struggled to respond appropriately. Ma'am, I just did what anyone would have done in that situation. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to find you and help you. Marie smiled, though sadness remained in her eyes. Private Richardson, you would be surprised how many people could have helped me over the past weeks but chose not to. The fact that you cannot imagine behaving differently tells me something important about who you are as a person. Hold on to that. The world will need more people like you in whatever comes after this conflict. As Marie was helped into the truck that would take her to the displaced persons facility, Richardson found himself thinking about her words. He had never considered himself particularly heroic or exceptional. He was just a farm boy from Nebraska, doing his job as a soldier. But Marie's experience had shown him that sometimes the most important actions are the simplest ones. Seeing other people as fully human and acting on that recognition even when others failed to do so. Over the following days, as Richardson's unit continued its advance through Bavaria, he found himself more alert to signs of civilian suffering and abuse. The intelligence gathered from Marie's testimony had been shared throughout the division, and soldiers were now specifically briefed to watch for similar situations and report them immediately. Richardson's discovery in Oberkirchen proved to be one of many that documented the systematic nature of abuse directed at various populations across German-controlled territory. Marie's detailed testimony became part of a larger body of evidence that would eventually be used in post-conflict proceedings to establish accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But for Richardson, the significance of that morning in Oberkirchen went beyond its contribution to historical documentation or legal proceedings. It had confronted him directly with questions about human dignity, moral responsibility, and the choices that individuals make when faced with others' suffering. 3 weeks later, as German forces in Bavaria surrendered and the immediate conflict phase drew to a close, Richardson received a letter forwarded through military channels. It was from Marie, now recovering at a displaced persons facility near Munich. Dear Private Richardson, the letter began, I wanted you to know that I am recovering well, both physically and emotionally. The doctors say I will make a full recovery, and I am already making plans for what I will do when I am ready to resume my life. The letter continued, more importantly, I wanted to tell you that what you did that morning in Oberkirchen gave me back something that I had feared was lost forever. My confidence that most people, when faced with obvious injustice, will choose to do the right thing. The sign around my neck said I was not human, but your actions proved that my humanity was never in question. It was only obscured by the cruelty and indifference of others. Marie's letter concluded, I am planning to return to teaching when circumstances permit. I want to ensure that future generations understand not only what happened during this time, but also why it happened and how ordinary people like yourself prevented it from being even worse. Thank you for reminding me that simple decency can overcome systematic cruelty, and that seeing others as fully human is the most important choice any of us can make. Richardson read and reread the letter, sharing it with his squad mates and eventually with Sergeant Murphy. The letter became something of a talisman for the unit, a reminder of why their mission had meaning beyond tactical objectives and strategic goals. Years later, after Richardson had returned to his family farm in Nebraska, he would often think about that morning in Oberkirchen. He had gone on to participate in the occupation of Germany and had witnessed the broader revelations about systematic abuse and genocide that shocked the world as Allied forces uncovered more and more evidence of the regime's crimes. But it was Marie's individual story and their brief encounter in that Bavarian village square that remained most vivid in his memory. She had taught him that heroism often consists not of grand gestures or dramatic actions, but simply of refusing to accept that any human being is not human, regardless of what signs others might hang around their necks. Richardson's grandson, interviewing him decades later for a school project about World War II veterans, asked him what he considered the most important thing he had done during the conflict. "I helped a woman who needed help," Richardson replied. "Someone had put a sign on her saying she wasn't human. I took the sign off and treated her like the person she was. That's what we were fighting for, really. The idea that every person matters and deserves to be treated with dignity." The grandson, expecting stories of dramatic battles or heroic actions, seemed puzzled by this simple answer. Richardson smiled and continued, "Son, the biggest battles aren't always the ones with the most shooting. Sometimes they're about whether you walk past someone who needs help or whether you stop and do something about it. The morning I met Marie Delacroix, I learned that the choice to see other people as fully human is the most important choice any of us ever makes." Marie's prediction about returning to teaching proved accurate. After her recovery, she eventually returned to France and then traveled back to Cameroon, where she established a school focused on educating young people about human rights and dignity. She corresponded occasionally with Richardson over the years, sharing news of her work and her students. In 1973, Marie visited the United States to speak at several universities about her experiences during the conflict. She made a special trip to Nebraska to visit Richardson and his family, meeting for the first time in nearly 3 decades the man who had freed her from that post in Oberkirchen. The reunion was emotional, but also practical. Marie spent several hours with Richardson's children and grandchildren, sharing stories not just about her own experiences, but about the importance of ordinary people making moral choices in difficult circumstances. "Your grandfather," she told them, "showed me that human decency is stronger than systematic cruelty, but only when individuals choose to act on their moral convictions rather than simply hoping someone else will take responsibility." Richardson, now in his 50s and graying, found himself once again impressed by Marie's dignity and wisdom. She had transformed her suffering into a lifetime commitment to education and human rights, using her experiences to prevent others from enduring similar treatment. During her visit, Marie shared information that she had never included in her wartime testimony. In the displaced persons facility where she had recovered, she had met dozens of other survivors with stories similar to her own. Together, they had formed an informal network dedicated to documenting their experiences and ensuring that such systematic dehumanization could never again be dismissed as isolated incidents or exaggerated claims. "Private Richardson," Marie said, using his old military rank with a smile, "you should know that the morning you found me in Oberkirchen, I had begun to believe that perhaps the sign around my neck was true, that maybe I had become something less than human through everything that had been done to me. Your simple act of removing that sign and treating me with basic respect reminded me that my humanity was never in question. That reminder saved not just my life, but my sense of self." Richardson, still uncomfortable with praise after all these years, deflected attention to Marie's own strength and resilience. But she would not allow him to minimize what he had done. "Thomas, you must understand that what you did required moral courage. There were military procedures you could have followed that would have been safer and easier. You could have reported my presence and waited for others to decide what to do. Instead, you immediately recognized that I was a person in need of help, and you acted on that recognition without hesitation. That choice, To see humanity where others had decided there was none made all the difference. Their conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics that ranged from their immediate families to the larger questions about human nature and moral responsibility that their encounter had raised. Marie shared her observations about how societies could be conditioned to accept systematic abuse of certain groups, while Richardson described his own evolution from a simple farm boy to someone who understood the complexity of moral choices in difficult circumstances. The most important lesson I learned from our experiences, Marie concluded, is that preventing systematic abuse requires ordinary people to make daily choices to recognize and defend the humanity of others, especially those who are different from themselves or who have been designated as other by those in power. Richardson nodded, thinking about his own community in Nebraska and how these lessons applied to peacetime situations. It's easier to see in wartime when the stakes are so obvious. But you're right that the same principles apply to how we treat people in our own communities who might be different or unpopular. Before Marie departed Nebraska, she visited Richardson's local church, where she spoke to a gathering of community members about her experiences and the lessons she had drawn from them. Her message was simple but powerful. Human dignity is not negotiable, and protecting it requires active choice rather than passive good intentions. When someone is designated as not human by those in authority, she told the gathering, it becomes the responsibility of ordinary people to prove that designation false through their actions. Thomas Richardson did this for me one morning in Germany 30 years ago, and that choice reverberated far beyond our brief encounter. The audience, mostly farmers and small business owners who had never traveled far from Nebraska, listened with rapt attention as Marie connected her wartime experiences to the everyday choices they faced in their own community. Her message was not about dramatic heroism, but about the cumulative impact of small decisions to treat all people with respect and dignity. After Marie's departure, Richardson found that their reunion had crystallized thoughts and feelings that had been developing over the decades since the conflict. He began speaking occasionally at local schools and community groups, sharing not detailed war stories, but reflections on the choices that individuals face when confronted with injustice or suffering. His message, influenced by Marie's perspective, focused on the idea that protecting human dignity is not primarily the responsibility of governments or institutions, but rather the daily obligation of ordinary citizens who must choose in small and large ways to recognize and defend the humanity of others. Richardson's speaking engagements gradually expanded beyond his immediate community as word spread about his thoughtful approach to discussing the moral lessons of wartime experience. He never presented himself as a hero, always emphasizing that what he had done in Oberkirchen was simply what any decent person should do when confronted with obvious suffering. The real heroes, he would tell his audiences, are people like Marie Delacroix, who survived systematic attempts to strip away their humanity and then spent their lives working to ensure that others never experienced the same treatment. All I did was recognize that she was a person who needed help. The hard work of turning that moment into lasting change, that was all her doing. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the conflict, Richardson received an invitation that surprised and honored him deeply. Marie, now in her 70s, and recognized internationally for her work in human rights education, was being honored by the United Nations for her contributions to preventing genocide and promoting human dignity. She had specifically requested that Richardson attend the ceremony as her guest. The ceremony in New York was unlike anything Richardson had ever experienced. Representatives from dozens of countries gathered to honor Marie's work, and speaker after speaker testified to the impact of her educational programs and advocacy efforts. Richardson sat in the audience, amazed at how far-reaching the consequences of that morning in Oberkirchen had proven to be. When Marie was called to the podium to accept her recognition, she began her remarks by telling the story of her liberation by an American soldier in a small German village. She described the sign that had declared her not human, and the simple act of human decency that had proven that sign false. The lesson of my experience, Marie told the distinguished audience, is not about the capacity for evil that human beings can display when they lose sight of others' humanity. That capacity is well documented and sadly familiar. The lesson is about the power of simple recognition, the choice to see another person as fully human and to act on that recognition even when it would be easier to look away. Marie's speech continued. Private First Class Thomas Richardson, who is with us today, probably never imagined that removing a cruel sign and offering basic kindness to a suffering woman would contribute to decades of work promoting human rights education. But that is precisely what happened, because acts of simple decency create ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. Richardson felt embarrassed by the public attention, but he understood that Marie was making a larger point about the way individual choices contribute to broader social change. Her work over the past 4 decades had reached thousands of students and educators around the world, all of it growing from that moment when someone chose to treat her as a human being deserving of help and respect. After the ceremony, Richardson and Marie had dinner together in New York, their first private conversation in over a decade. Marie, now white-haired but still possessed of the dignity and intelligence that had impressed Richardson so many years earlier, reflected on the path that had brought them from a war-torn German village to a United Nations ceremony. Thomas, I want you to understand something that I have learned through all these years of working with young people. The choice you made that morning in Oberkirchen was not unusual because it required special courage or training. It was unusual because too many people, when faced with similar situations, choose to look away or assume that someone else will take responsibility. Richardson considered this observation, thinking about his own community and the various situations where people faced choices about whether to intervene when others were suffering or being treated unfairly. What you're saying is that the problem isn't that people don't know the right thing to do, it's that they choose not to do it. Marie nodded. Exactly. Most people, when they see someone tied to a post with a sign saying "not human," know instinctively that this is wrong and that the person needs help. The failure comes when they convince themselves that it is not their responsibility or that intervening would be too dangerous or complicated. Their conversation continued into the evening, exploring the ways that societies and individuals can be conditioned to accept or ignore systematic mistreatment of others. Marie shared insights from her decades of educational work, while Richardson offered perspectives from his experiences as a farmer and community member, dealing with more ordinary but still significant examples of social exclusion and prejudice. The most important thing I have learned, Marie concluded, is that preventing large-scale atrocities requires millions of small-scale choices by ordinary people to recognize and defend the humanity of others. What happened to me during the conflict was possible only because so many people made daily choices to treat people like me as less than human, or at least to accept such treatment as normal. Richardson's final public speaking engagement came in 1992 when he was invited to address a conference on genocide prevention hosted by the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. Now in his 70s, he had become one of the last living witnesses to the liberation of Nazi concentration camps and forced labor facilities. His speech, delivered to an audience of scholars, policymakers, and survivors, focused on the theme that had emerged from his decades of reflection on the events in Oberkirchen, the critical importance of individual moral choices in preventing or enabling systematic abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, Richardson began, I am not here as an expert on genocide or human rights law. I am here as someone who, on one morning in April of 1945, faced a choice between walking past a suffering human being or stopping to help. I want to talk about that choice and about the consequences of the millions of similar choices that people make every day. Richardson's speech described his discovery of Marie and the subsequent decades of friendship and reflection that had grown from their brief wartime encounter. He emphasized that preventing systematic abuse requires not just laws and institutions, but a culture in which ordinary people consistently choose to recognize and defend the humanity of others. Marie Delacroix taught me that the sign around her neck that day, "not human," was only effective because too many people had accepted its message or chosen not to challenge it. Removing that sign was simple, The hard work was creating a society where such signs cannot be placed around anyone's neck in the first place. The audience responded with sustained applause, but Richardson concluded with a challenge rather than comfortable reassurance. Each of you will leave here today and return to your communities, your workplaces, your schools, and families. You will encounter situations where someone is being treated as less than fully human, perhaps not with a literal sign, but through exclusion, discrimination, or simple indifference to their suffering. The question is not whether you will face such situations, but whether you will choose to act when you do. After his speech, Richardson was approached by numerous audience members who shared their own stories of moral choices and their consequences. Many were survivors of various atrocities who wanted to thank him for articulating the importance of individual responsibility in preventing systematic abuse. One conversation particularly moved Richardson. A young teacher from Rwanda, who had survived the genocide there, told him that Marie's educational work had influenced the development of human rights curricula in African schools. The ripple effects of that morning in Oberkirchen, she explained, were still expanding decades later as new generations learned about the importance of defending human dignity. Richardson returned to Nebraska from the Washington Conference with a renewed sense of the significance of seemingly small moral choices. His own choice to help Marie had seemed obvious and unremarkable at the time, but the decades that followed had shown him how individual decisions contribute to larger patterns of social behavior that can either enable or prevent systematic abuse. In his final years, Richardson often sat on his front porch in the evenings, looking out over the Nebraska farmland that had shaped his character and values. He would think about Marie, now in her 80s, and still working to educate young people about human rights, and about the morning in Oberkirchen that had connected their lives and taught them both lessons about the power of simple human decency. Marie continued to correspond with Richardson until his death in 1995, 50 years after their encounter in that German village square. Her final letter to him, written as he battled the illness that would claim his life, summarized the lessons of their shared experience. "Dear Thomas, as we both near the end of our lives, I want you to know that everything I have accomplished in my work for human rights grew from the moment when you chose to see me as a person who needed help, rather than as the not human thing that others had decided I was. Your simple act of recognition gave me back my sense of self and made possible all the work that followed." Marie's letter continued, "I have spent decades teaching young people about the Holocaust, about genocide, and about the systematic ways that human beings can be conditioned to treat others as less than human. But the most important lesson I share with them is the one you taught me, that such systematic abuse is only possible when ordinary people make daily choices to accept or ignore the suffering of others." The letter concluded, "You never wanted to be called a hero, and I respect that. But I want you to know that your choice that morning was heroic precisely because it was so simple and obvious to you. In a world where many people had learned to walk past suffering and tell themselves it was not their responsibility, you stopped and acted like a decent human being. That choice made all the difference, not just for me personally, but for all the students I have been able to teach, because you gave me back my belief in human goodness." Thomas Richardson died peacefully on his Nebraska farm in the spring of 1995, surrounded by his family and secure in the knowledge that his life had mattered in ways that extended far beyond his farming operations and military service. His funeral was attended not only by local family and friends, but by several individuals whose lives had been touched by his story and by Marie's subsequent work in human rights education. Marie, now too frail to travel from France to Nebraska, sent a representative to read a statement at Richardson's funeral. The statement celebrated his life and character, but focused primarily on the lesson that their shared experience offered to future generations. Thomas Richardson showed the world that preventing systematic abuse of human beings requires not special training or exceptional courage, but simply the willingness to recognize others as fully human and to act on that recognition. He proved that a simple act of decency can have consequences that extend across decades and continents, touching lives in ways that the actor never imagines. The statement continued, "As we honor Thomas's memory, We should remember that each of us faces similar choices in our own communities and circumstances. The question is not whether we will encounter suffering or injustice, but whether we will choose to respond with the same simple human decency that Thomas showed on a spring morning in Germany 50 years ago. Marie's statement concluded with a challenge that Richardson himself would have endorsed. The best way to honor Thomas Richardson's memory is not to build monuments or create formal tributes, but to live by the example he set, to see others as fully human and to act on that recognition, especially when it would be easier to look away. In the years following Richardson's death, Marie established a scholarship program in his name, providing educational opportunities for young people committed to human rights work. The scholarship criteria was simple. Candidates had to demonstrate a commitment to recognizing and defending the dignity of all human beings, particularly those who might be marginalized or designated as other by society. The first recipients of the Richardson Scholarship included students from around the world who had shown exceptional commitment to preventing discrimination and abuse in their own communities. Their work ranged from advocating for refugee rights to combating racial prejudice to protecting the rights of disabled individuals, all applications of the basic principle that Richardson had demonstrated in Oberkirchen. Marie continued her educational work well into her 80s, always concluding her presentations with the story of her liberation by an American soldier who chose to see her as human when others had decided she was not. Her message remained consistent across decades. Preventing systematic abuse requires millions of individual choices by ordinary people to recognize and defend the humanity of others. When Marie Delacroix died in 2003 at the age of 87, her obituaries appeared in newspapers around the world. They celebrated her contributions to human rights education and genocide prevention, but they all began with the same story: how a young American soldier in a German village had removed a sign declaring her not human and treated her with simple, human decency. The obituaries noted that Marie's educational programs had reached tens of thousands of students across 6 continents, all of them learning the lesson that Richardson had taught through his actions, that human dignity must be actively defended through individual choices, not simply protected through laws and institutions. Marie's funeral in Paris was attended by former students, fellow human rights advocates and government officials from numerous countries. The eulogy was delivered by one of her former students, now a prominent human rights lawyer, who had been inspired by Marie's teaching to dedicate his career to preventing genocide and systematic abuse. Marie Delacroix taught us that the Holocaust, genocides, and systematic abuse of human beings are not primarily the result of evil leaders or bad law, the speaker said. They are the result of millions of ordinary people making daily choices to treat others as less than human, or to accept such treatment as normal and inevitable. The eulogy continued. But Marie also taught us that if systematic abuse depends on millions of small choices by ordinary people, then preventing it also depends on millions of small choices by ordinary people. Choices to recognize the humanity of others and to act on that recognition even when it is difficult or inconvenient. The speaker concluded by returning to the story of Marie's liberation in Oberkirchen. Private First Class Thomas Richardson probably thought he was simply doing his job when he freed Marie from that post in 1945. But Marie understood that he was doing something much more important. He was proving that human decency is stronger than systematic cruelty, and that simple acts of recognition can have consequences that extend across generations. Today, more than 75 years after that spring morning in Oberkirchen, the story of Thomas Richardson and Marie Delacroix continues to be told in human rights education programs around the world. Their brief encounter has become a powerful illustration of the way individual moral choices contribute to larger patterns of social behavior that either enable or prevent systematic abuse. The lesson of their story remains as relevant today as it was in 1945. Human dignity must be actively defended through the daily choices of ordinary people, and the most important choice any individual can make is to see others as fully human, regardless of what signs society might hang around their necks. Museums and educational centers that teach about genocide and human rights often conclude their presentations with Richardson and Marie's story, using it to challenge visitors to consider their own responses to suffering and injustice in their communities. The question they pose is simple but profound. When you encounter someone who is being treated as less than human, will you walk past, or will you stop and act? The scholarship program established in Richardson's name continues to support young people around the world who have demonstrated commitment to defending human dignity in their own communities. Recent recipients have included advocates for immigrant rights, activists working to combat ethnic prejudice, and educators developing programs to prevent bullying and social exclusion. Each scholarship recipient is required to read the account of Richardson's encounter with Marie and to write an essay reflecting on its relevance to their own work. The essays consistently return to the same theme: that preventing systematic abuse requires ordinary people to make extraordinary choices to recognize and defend the humanity of others. The story of that morning in Oberkirchen has been translated into dozens of languages and adapted for different cultural contexts, but its essential message remains unchanged. When individuals choose to see others as fully human and act on that recognition, they create ripple effects that can extend far beyond their immediate circumstances and influence the moral development of entire societies. As we face contemporary challenges related to human rights, discrimination, and the treatment of refugees and marginalized populations, the example set by Thomas Richardson and the insights shared by Marie Delacroix offer both guidance and inspiration. Their story reminds us that protecting human dignity is not primarily the responsibility of governments or institutions, but the daily obligation of ordinary citizens who must choose, in small and large ways, to recognize and defend the humanity of others. The wooden post where Marie was displayed in Oberkirchen was removed decades ago, and the village square now hosts farmers' markets and community celebrations. But the lesson of what happened there continues to resonate: that human dignity is either actively defended or passively surrendered through the cumulative impact of individual choices made by ordinary people in their daily lives. When young people today visit museums and memorial sites that commemorate the victims of genocide and systematic abuse, they are challenged to consider not just what happened to those who suffered, but what choices they themselves will make when confronted with injustice and suffering in their own communities and circumstances. The most fitting memorial to Thomas Richardson and Marie Delacroix is not a monument or plaque, but the continued willingness of ordinary people to remove whatever signs designate others as not human, and to treat all people with the dignity and respect that Richardson showed on that spring morning in Germany, when he chose to see a suffering woman as a person who needed help, rather than as the object that others had decided she was. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.